So getting started here, it's pretty much assumed that everybody in this room has some type of vested interest in search, whether it's e-commerce site search or some form of enterprise search. Well, when you look at e-commerce site search, what we do know is that 30% of the people who come to your website will use your search technology. And we know today there's a correlation between really good site search technology and purchase conversion. Now, when it gets to enterprise search, it's a lot trickier. There's some interesting stats out there. What we found is that 50% of US and European companies state that it's hard to find their own data. And 3 out of 4 people in those companies say, yeah, it's way easier to find data outside our system than our system of record. I mean, for me and my company, if somebody tells me a file's in SharePoint, I just cringe. It's a black hole. That's a problem. See a lot of people going, yeah, I get it, I get it. But what this tells us is there's some questions we have to answer. For e-commerce, how do we improve search with growing inventories, changes in season, new trends, new fashions? And on the enterprise side, how do we improve search when our data is just piling up underneath us? So on the topic of improving search, I'm going to hand it over to Grant, who's going to give you a few of his thoughts and comments.
Yeah, thanks everyone, and we do have a demo at the end of all this stuff, by the way. So kind of a little bit of background. I met Kevin, I think 2 years ago at SIG-IR, which is one of the big academic conferences. And I think like all of you, we've kind of been trying to figure out how do we get better relevance out of all this stuff, right? And being a solar expert, I've done all the tricks in the book. I've done all the eDismax settings and my sloppy phrases and all of that kind of stuff. And I can tune the heck out of the keyword matching in the system, right? But one of the things that I think all of us struggle with is how do we know whether what we're doing is right or not, right? And I think all of you have kind of gone through things that I've done. I call them, in fact, things like pet peeve queries, where you're sitting in your room, you're doing all your programming work, you've got the system up and running, and all of a sudden your boss comes in, hair on fire. I did a query for this, and the results suck, right? And you're like, hold on there, boss. I think maybe we should take a step back. But you probably then go and do that query, and you're like, yeah, they really do stink. I'm going to fix those. And then you go and fix that one, and then he comes back the next day, and then she comes back the next day, and so on and so forth. And you don't really, you feel like you're whack-a-mole when it comes to relevance. And I think the big reason that's happening is because we don't have good, solid human judgments around what do people actually care about. So when I met Kevin, he said, hey, we're this crowdsourcing company. We do all those human judgments. And I said, great, this is the one big missing piece when I think about what we offer at Lucidworks, right? We've got this great product that can build machine learning. We've got the solar inside. We've got all these things. But if anybody who knows machine learning knows you need training data, you need gold standards, you need all these things that actually tell you underneath the hood what's right and wrong. So we kind of took a step back and said, as we start to think about how do we present a much more complete picture around how do you improve search, if you've been paying attention in your interactions with Lucidworks, first and foremost, we try to make sure that you are capturing all the user interactions. So your users, of course, are telling you a lot of things about search, but that in itself is also imperfect, right? Users are reacting to your system, so by definition, if your system is bad, then you're getting bad data out of that. So sometimes you need to take a step back and look at a much more complete picture. One of the other things we really saw with a lot of our customers is they're very rule-driven, and so they weren't really taking on an experimentation mindset when it came to their system, right? So we really said to the people, we want to make sure you have purposeful use of rules, but then also let the algorithms do their thing, right? And so kind of at the end of the day, we put together a system that's all about how do we capture and think about relevance and improving the system in the context of several key pieces. First off, the context side of the house really is about all the things that you've already been, the content side of the house is really about all the things that you've already been doing in Solar, namely you're working on your content, your keyword matching, you're doing things like putting in boosts and blocks and all of that kind of stuff. But then we also wanted to have some focus on the consumer side of it. How are people interacting with the site? What are they clicking on? What are they sharing? And that's really where a lot of this human annotated stuff comes in as well, because now all of a sudden we can bring some expertise to bear on the site as well. And then last but not least, when I think about the overall picture of relevance, you want to do things in context. Right? We want to do things, if somebody's searching for shovel and it's December in Minnesota, that's a very different context than somebody searching for shovel in Florida, whatever time of year it is, right? And so having that context of who the user is, where the user is, all of those kinds of things. And so these days when I think about relevance, it's kind of like, let's take and mash all of those things together, right? And when you're doing that mashing together, one of the things you find is, okay, I've got them all mashed together, but which one's most important for which queries and for which user interactions? And I think these days, as we start to dig in more on the machine learning side of the house, it really is becoming more and more apparent that we as humans can't manage all of the variables, but we as humans can, of course, collect the information about how everybody is interacting with it, and then we can feed this into these much more fancy algorithms. And so I think what you're starting to see is the state of the art when it comes to relevance is something like you've got your core Lucene, your core Solar. That does your coarse-grained retrieval, right? And then you have these machine learning models that you're training on top of all the data that your users and your crowd is giving you in terms of what actually matters. In the academic literature, you see this called something like cascading re-ranking. You might have a model, a machine learning model that takes the top 1,000 results out of Solar and then feeds it through a really simple classifier like logistic regression, right? And then you might take the top 20 results or however many results you're showing on the page, and that gets fed through a much more sophisticated ranker like maybe a random forest or a deep learning, et cetera. In some extreme cases, I've even seen 3 or 4 other models where it might be 1 versus 2 and 2 versus 3 and all of that kind of stuff as well. And if you think about all the underpinnings of that is all of this machine learning data. And if you've ever done machine learning, you know that you need to have good training data in order to build those things. And that's really what, in us working together was all about. How do we make that last bit, that last hardest part, in fact, a part of the overall process that people do when it comes to deploying search?
Great. So as it relates to machine learning, one of the biggest challenges we hear from our clients is how do we get structured data? And when you look at the world today, on the internet, 80% of all digital data is unstructured. It's growing at a rate of 60% annually. And this data isn't, very easy to mine, when you need it too. So why is structured data important? Well, if you're modeling and using unstructured data, you're seriously in a scenario of garbage in, garbage out. And why is that? Because unstructured data is incomplete, it's noisy, and it's inconsistent. Now that's where Appen, the company I work for, comes into the picture. What we do is we provide structured data to enhance machine learning. I'm just going to say that one more time. Structured data to enhance machine learning. Now, how we do this is we have a suite of services that evolve around speech, e-commerce, natural language processing, content relevance. But to break that down even more, if you need human annotated data to improve search relevance, we provide that service. If you need categorization to improve site search, we provide that service. If you need, just going down my list more, labeling or tagging to improve your training sets, we do that. If you need voice transcription, we do that. And I can keep going on and on and on, but what we do is we decorate data to enhance machine learning. That's what we do as a company, and we structure it. Now, where do we fit into the ecosystem? This is always one of the biggest challenges when I'm meeting with a new client. When you look at the e-commerce system from search to the actual purchase, we're involved in those first 2 stages. We're providing human annotated data to improve the search and the browsing process. We're not involved in the cart process or the purchase process. We're involved in that process to help improve the user experience while they're shopping. On the enterprise side, using CRM customer data as an example, there's that whole point of searching for data and then some type of action on that data. We're involved, again, in that one part of search and browse, and sometimes that involves some types of categorization or tagging. So we have a very specific point in the process where human annotation data is of value. One of our clients, eBay, they have applied human annotation data to their machine learning strategy for several years. Now, important note here, eBay understands the law of the internet. Too many clicks, you kill the purchasing process. So they applied human annotated data to improve not only the search experience, but the overall experience on the website. Now, they're not the only ones applying that type of methodology. Anybody who is monetizing search and has a very robust machine learning strategy is in some form applying human annotated data. Everybody from Alibaba, Amazon, eBay, Flipkart, Walmart, the list goes on. And they need human annotated data to improve personalization, product search, categorization. There's a whole list of projects we work on with our clients. When we work with an eBay, it's just not one project. I mean, there is experimentation done almost every quarter on some different type of concept. Now, why is human annotated data good for machine learning? Because there's certain things humans can do that a machine can't do, and I see a lot of people nodding on that. Humans can manage subjectivity, machine can't. Humans understand intent better, a machine can't. And humans have are better at coping with ambiguity. So, knowing this, Lucidworks has made available the opportunity to have human annotation for their new Fusion product, which is the whole purpose of the discussion today. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to turn it over to Grant again so he can give you a demo of the proof of concept we've been working on to apply human annotation to prove search.
Yeah, great, thanks. Yeah, I mean, I think, like I said, when we started looking at this at first, what I wanted to do is, if you talk with Kevin, a lot of times he'll come in and they're very custom solutions for customers. And I said, I want to turn that on its head a little bit. I think there's some things that we can essentially make cookie cutter. Certain tasks that we know every single time you do this kind of thing, you need human annotated data. And so I wanted to bake that into the product. And so what I'm going to just show you is a little preview of something that's coming out in a future version of Fusion. But we have up and running. We've been using it internally for some of our own studies, some of our ways of getting data into the system. I'll show you some prototype things, and I'll also talk a little bit about some other things we're doing around relevance. And, good Lord willing, live demos, this will all go well. You all know how that works, so. So if you're not familiar, Fusion at the end of the day, Solar underneath, Spark underneath. I kind of like to think about it. Solar is where I have all my current understanding of my data. Spark is where I try to figure out how to make my data smarter, right? And if you haven't heard the pitch, one of the things we try to do with Fusion is capture everything in Solar underneath the hood, right? All your core product catalog, your core data goes in there, but then we also store, for instance, all the signals, all those event interactions, et cetera. And by closing that loop, we think we have a much more capable system than what we see in most, especially retail systems, whereby marketing often owns all the analytics data. They dump it out to some big clunky Hadoop cluster. Their data science folks go and build an R model. The engineers look at the R model and say, are you kidding me? Business says, hey, I want that R model. It's got better uplift. Engineers say, okay, well, but I got to rewrite it in Java or Scala or fill in the blank production programming language. And it's going to be 4 months. Business is like, are you crazy? Why can't you get this done faster? Lather, rinse, repeat. This ability to do experimentation all of a sudden just drains the lifeblood of the company, right? Because they can't experiment fast enough, right? And so like I said, one of the things as I looked at it is like we're capturing all the signals. We already have all the core data in there. But the one thing we're missing is the actual judgments, right? This ability to go take in labeled data and create machine learning models and all of that kind of stuff. So if you've seen, for instance, demos of Fusion. You can go and point and click and build random forest models, logistic regression models, recommenders, and all of that stuff. But again, there's still this question, this open question we all have is it any good? That's the dirty little secret of all this machine learning stuff is, yeah, it's a lot of fun to work on as an engineer, but is it any good, right? And so one of the things we wanted to help address is that question by integrating these together. So I'm just going to click in. This is a slightly older version of Fusion, so the version you might download will look a little bit different. But essentially, I've got set up a couple of different collections here. If you've seen me give our e-commerce demo, then you know what this one is all about. I've got over here a core product catalog of things like warranties, and there's iPads, and there's CDs, and all of that kind of stuff in here. So that's my core product catalog. And then we've got all of our signals, all of the clicks and all of that people have, right? And so one of the things we decided, or the way we decided to integrate this is we just added in this notion of a crowdsourcing manager. And the basic idea behind it is to take away all that plumbing code that you would have to write to integrate, for instance, with Appen, right? They have APIs they expose, but you have to write code then to ship up your data. And so we just said, well, let's take care of all that plumbing for you, right? So for instance, I can set up a job here I fill out a couple of things, my API keys and all of that kind of stuff, and then I can set up, so I set up essentially a project, because a lot of times when you think about relevance, what you're really trying to do is track relevance over time. So the way we think about this is we're going to set up a project, and then within the project, we're going to have instances where we're essentially shipping data up to the crowd to then go do their annotations, right? Some companies do this every 6 months. Some companies do it every quarter. Some companies do it every month. I think you even have some companies that do it every week, if I'm right. So, depending on kind of how your budget is and all of that, you can scale this. And so, I set up a project. I happen to have one set up here already. I've got my project credentials underneath already set up there. And then we have the notion of jobs, right? And a job is essentially an instance of me running and executing that project, so I can schedule it. I can say, I'm going to ship all this data up. Appen's going to go do their magical crowd thing behind the scenes. And then whenever it's available, I'm going to automatically download that data and install it back into the system, right? And again, if you've ever heard my broken record spiel, all the data ends up right back into Fusion, right back into Solar underneath the hood. So all the annotated data is there for you and available, which is great because then you can start to track it historically. You can see how the crowd is shifting over time. You can put your own level of quality assurance on top of what Appen is doing in terms of quality assurance. And so you have a much deeper understanding of what's going on. So I've just got a couple of different projects here. One of the things, for instance, we were testing out is how does Fusion's relevance built in compared to just raw Solar's relevance. So using, for instance, our signal clickstream models, how does that compare to Fusion? We also have set up a query intent one. The basic idea here, sorry, where did that go? There it is. The basic idea behind the query intent. So essentially, sorry, let me back up. We set out with two cookie cutter types of jobs. One was just, what's my search relevance? And second, tell me my query intent, my user's query intent. Because we think those are two really important things for understanding relevance and improving relevance. If you can predict that user's intent up front, then you can make way smarter decisions about how you query Solar, for instance, underneath the hood, right? So that's what this does. I've got all of that set up in here. You essentially hit the start button. It goes off and does its thing. Depending on how you've contracted with Appen, there's different levels of scaling of how fast they return the data and all that stuff. Fusion will just sit and kind of monitor the APIs and say, oh, there's a new tranche of data available. They're done with their work. Let me bring it back in. Further along with this in Fusion, you can now imagine I can completely close the loop, right? Because I can then go and automatically train a classifier, for instance, and automatically deploy that back into production. So if you've seen that kind of stuff, or if you want to see that kind of stuff, stop by our booth. We have demos that show those kinds of things. And like I said, essentially that one thing that was missing was the annotations. So if I go in, like I said, the data itself is in Fusion itself, right? And in fact, what I have here now in my signals collection, which is where I decided to dump out the data, is I have all my raw clicks, but then I also have these annotation jobs here, which just are another Solar documents. So they essentially look like, in this particular case, there's a query. The user's query was Bluetooth mouse. The judgment ID was here. We've got some information about product IDs. And then we've got, essentially the crowd gave us back, this was a bad rating. The rating score was 4, so on and so forth. They're essentially telling me, for this query in this document, what did the crowd think about it, right? And so all of that data is right back in Fusion, which means then, all of the Spark tools, all the machine learning stuff that we do, you can go build out on top of that. To bring that home a little bit more, one of the things we did is in Fusion, we have this dashboarding capability available. So for instance, you can start to visualize this stuff as well, right? Which means I can build a dashboard that actually looks at all of the underlying analytics. So for instance, when I run that query intent job, you can see, for instance, there's different codes assigned to it. I can see what are all the different intents just at a glance. Put up a pie chart that says, oh, this intent was a product purchase intent. This intent was a concept search. This was a support intent, however you want to go and do that. We also have lots of information about the queries. I can even set up dashboards. For instance, this is comparing some of the metrics between Solar and Fusion in terms of things like MRR or precision at 10, some of those key metrics that you might want to calculate. And of course, at the end of the day, because all of this data is in Solar underneath the hood, I can query it just like I query any of my other stuff, right? So the DevOps around this is just go do more of the exact same thing that I'm already used to doing, namely querying Solar. So for instance, a dumb little panel over here on the right that's just looking at stats around queries for LCD TV, which if you look over here is the most popular query in this data set. Also iPad versus touchpad and all of that. And for the sake of the demo here, we didn't go do a full annotation of all of the documents and all of the content, right? Typically you're gonna pick, probably like your head queries plus some sampling of the tails. You can set up and control all of those things in the interface as well, like how much data do you actually want to send? How do you want to sample from that data? We imagine over time we'll be enhancing those kinds of capabilities as well, such that you have even more fine-grained control. You can even specifically say, I want to send these things regardless of their volume. So perhaps you want to test out some new product or new feature or new search capability, and you want crowd feedback, you can do those kinds of things as well, right? So that's a pretty quick and dirty demo around all of that stuff. Like I said, all of it is driven off of, if we go back to the crowdsourcing manager, you have total control over all of the data that you're sending. So for instance, in this one, I can give it start and end dates of how often I want it to go. I can set up the queries. I can tell it how many queries out of the top I want to send, how many random queries, how many documents do I want them to score, so on and so forth, right? And behind the scenes, all we're really doing is hitting the signals data and the product catalog data with Solar queries, packaging it all up, shipping it up to them, downloading it back down, and feeding it back into the cycle. So I think that's it for the demo. So let me switch back to the slides. Like I said, a couple other things on this. This is something we will be coming out, probably be in our 4.1 release. We're still working with engineering on when exactly it'll be slated. One of the other things that's coming, so that dashboard that I have, that I just showed you, in 4.0 actually, so our next release, which will be kind of this fall, or this, towards the end of the year, sometime there, all of those dashboards will be built right in. And in fact, we'll have the ability to go and test your relevance over time, track relevance over time, and use things like clicks as a pseudo judgments and track against them. And then you'll also be able to, once this is added in, say, hey, I want to take my raw clicks from my users, but I also want to have gold standard judgments in there as well. And so can we track how those compare over time, et cetera. So a lot more capabilities coming in Fusion in our 4.0 or our 4X series around tracking and understanding relevance at a much deeper level. We also have some tools coming around helping you, for instance, manage your query distributions, like how the head and the tail relate to each other. So there again, a great place where annotations can help you better focus your time as well. So it's not just about training data, but it's also about how and where do you spend your time by having the crowd kind of show you what actually matters in your data.
So when we talk with clients in the industry, they really fall into two categories. There's the clients that are just now developing a machine learning strategy, and then there's companies who have pretty robust machine learning strategies. So I'm just curious from the attendees in the room today, if you would mind helping out here, if you consider yourself kind of just starting out, can you guys raise your hand? Okay, and for those who think they have a pretty strong, robust machine learning strategy, raise your hand. Yeah, that's about the percentage that I would expect, because the machine learning concept isn't, I don't want to say it's a new concept because it's been out for a few years, but once you get outside the Alexa 100, that group of companies who are looking at trying to expand that type of strategy. And when we meet with them, there's several questions that come up, and the ones I have listed here is like, do you have enough data for machine learning? Do you have enough data to get a signal out of the data you have? If we've had companies come up to us that are in e-commerce and they're like, help us with our search, and I said, how big's your inventory? Oh, we have 1,000 products. Yeah, that's I don't know. Stick to the rules. I don't know what to tell them. There has to be a certain amount of data to get a signal. The other item is your company willing to invest in machine learning? Some teams, what's nice about what Grant's putting together, it takes away some of that investment into the whole data scientist community that we see, Google. When we meet with them, they have hundreds of data scientists working on the project. They have it more packaged up from that standpoint, but it's just something you have to determine internally. Can you prove there's a value? And for e-commerce, it's easy. It's purchase conversion. Prove there's a value to it. Next item is, do you have a team available to manage and analyze the data? There comes a point where you have to look at it internally, and I think Grant touched base on that a lot, and analyze it and see if it's meeting your needs. And then, last, are you able to action against the dashboard metrics? I mean, it's good to see those metrics and say, hey, my relevance is improving or it's not improving. Do you know what to do, and do you know how to action against that? If you look at query intent, if you find out most of the people would come, somebody told me a story here recently on query intent that said Sears had a query intent story where a lot of the queries were about refrigerator parts. It wasn't about other products. So if that's what your customers are coming for, you better be able to feed up the best refrigerator part list that comes to the table. So I appreciate everybody coming here today. I'd like to open it up to questions to see what thoughts and comments people have here today. Yes, sir.
Sorry. Two people each pointing.
And for the record, suit means sales guy, casual means technical guy. So you know which way to address the question.
Yeah, so the way we've started off, kind of any typical partnership that you're exploring is, let's see who's interested first. And so we've done a pretty lightweight integration where if you have, what I demoed now in the prototype was essentially plug in your keys for Appen, and then it will just work, right? We're still kind of exploring what the longer term interest level is in terms of, hey, do we just make it a part of, when you buy Fusion, there's a subscription in there. Do we, how do we want to go do that? So. Yeah, and on the lack of data thing too, I mean, it's important to note that, this isn't always just about clicks in an e-commerce scenario, right? Like in the enterprise too, being able to categorize your data, you maybe have a taxonomy, but you need training data in order to say, hey, this data, this is about, hammers, or this data is about politics, this data is about sports, et cetera. You need that kind of training data too. I kind of take that step back of what Kevin said is you think about, am I monetizing this at the end of the day? Or what's the cost of me not having a better quality? And of course, in order to answer the question of what's the cost, well, first off, you need to know whether you even have good quality or not, right? And so that's why we started focusing first on let's do the search relevance, and then let's go do some of these more advanced labeling and machine learning tasks. Yeah. I think there was somebody over here first.
So, Kevin, you mentioned that if we don't have human annotated data, which a lot of people don't, Appen can provide that. Can you give an example?
So we don't just provide raw data that's been annotated. We'll annotate your data, because your data is going to be specific to your inventory needs. So what it means is through the process here, as you set up the crowdsourcing workbench, you decide how much data you send to us. We annotate it, and then it's through the pipeline, and it's brought back to you. Yes, sir.
Much control of the profile of the crowdsourcing you have. For example, do you have regional control, like East Coast versus West Coast, or male versus female?
Yeah.
Repeat the question.
That's a very, very good question. So
sorry, real quick. The question was how much control do you have over the crowd and who gets to actually see the data?
Yeah. So crowd demographics is a growing area in our business. We have just our qualified crowd. So when we talk about crowd, it isn't where you send us work and we find anybody who can work on it. They have to actually go through a qualification process for this project, and they have to prove that they actually have the ability to do this project. What's an interesting statistic is that we found that only 15% of the population has an innate ability to actually do search relevance work. So so our whole job is finding that science of that 15%. And then there's another science on how you never ruin their ability to do a particular job. So that's kind of where we were, but where we're getting to now is we're getting companies who are developing, who have data annotation needs that are getting into all different types of areas. Like when it gets into healthcare, we're doing data annotation, and they require that the crowd be nurse practitioners, nurses, and doctors. We've had legal projects come up to us where it had to be, the data annotation had to be done by very specific, they had to have 2 years or at least minimum work experience. But then we've had demographics where from the age of 18 to 60, we had to have so many people in each age group. And we've had demographics where they had to be a very specific job experience in a very specific vertical, like sales, medical, industrial. So sometimes the crowd work requires a discussion as to what your pain point is, what you're trying to achieve, and us making sure we map the service we provide to meet that need.
I think they're the one on the right, and then we'll go to the one right next to it. Yeah, you.
How do you combine the clickstream data with the annotated data? Can you build a model?
So the question was, have we combined the clickstream data with the annotated data? Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly what you're trying to do here, right? Is the clickstream data, kind of gives you the flavor of the month or the flavor of the day in the sense that here's what your users care about right now. Where the crowd kind of does is give you that sanity check around it. At least that's how I think about it, right? Is these are people who are maybe a little bit more expert, right? As he said, once he's identified that 15% of people who can actually do this, you don't want to let them go, right? And so they have a little bit deeper experience. Like you all in this room probably have a lot of that experience too, but guess what? You cost a lot more, right? And so, it becomes like, can I balance my costs, my time needs with what users on the whole, our customers are telling us with, a little bit more of a scientific approach around, or a little bit more rigorous approach on actually doing annotation. Like I've been in the academic community, we've done this, we used to do this all just internally within our own departments and all that of actually hand scoring things. It's a big pain in the butt, but you develop an expertise around it over time. It's just, not necessarily the most effective use of your time, right? And I think,
how do you, relevance and semantics are context sensitive, they're in line with the user. It's not like nouns and products, which, a hammer is a hammer. So how can, if somebody uploads data and then it goes to Appen to tag, how can you possibly know
Yeah, well, with each project we do, we have extensive guidelines that go along with it. We have one project where there's 150 pages of guidelines on how to actually make that rating. And in that type of project, you can imagine the people we have in the crowd that actually qualified for it. We never let those type of people go. But it's literally an art, you know. Is it a perfect art? I mean, you're balancing, you know, can the machine do it better or the human do it better? So will every item be perfect? Maybe, maybe not. Funny, we only have a couple minutes left, but a funny area where crowdsourcing was inventive one time was, it used to be like on the big web search sites, if you typed in anything, Wikipedia would show up. And that was a problem. So they had to go through some type of course correction with human annotation, because if Machu Picchu was the search and Wikipedia came up, that made sense. If hiking boots, just that word hiking boots, was the search and Wikipedia came up, that didn't make sense. So we had to retrain the system to think that whole process out. And you know, it took a lot of data to do that. So
I would say the other thing, you know, like in the way we thought about this from our side was just, we just give you controls and you can ship up. You could, you know, if you looked at some of them, I would be shipping up like image URL, the URLs for the images. So like if I'm doing a search for, I think your question, you know, like around hammers or support or whatever, right? Like you could also, the document itself would have some of that metadata that helps the person make a judgment. But you know, at the end of the day, right, like it's never perfect, of course, right? You're just trying to at least get a sense of what do actual users or pseudo users, if you will, look like, right? I think maybe we've got time for one more question or two more.
I was just going to ask you, so do you have multiple annotators rate individual documents? And if so, how do you measure innovator review?
yeah, so that's a good question. So that all gets into quality control. You know, various companies want, you know, anywhere from 2 to 10x in quality control. When you're doing 2x, two people rating the same item, if they both agree, it doesn't mean it's right. But if they both agree, it's considered done. If they don't agree, it goes to a third-party arbitrator to review it. So.
And then they also, I know, you know, so one of the things that people often, like when I was thinking about this, was, oh, well, I'll just go do Mechanical Turk. But, you know, if you go actually talk to people who do Mechanical Turk, you often end up spending a lot more because you have to then go get a much bigger crowd because it's a whole bunch of garbage stuff in there, right? Whereas they'll give people, in a system like this, they'll give people tests to make sure they're actually paying attention, whereas in Mechanical Turk, you have to build in a lot of that stuff yourself, so.
So I think we're running out of time. Real quick.
Just one question I had actually, similar topic, the domain expertise, like the company who has such capability, they might have that domain expertise, but how do you leverage that domain expertise with the crowd shows, because they might not have that much knowledge. And the other question I had, like the company who wants to expand globally, like, you know,
Yes.
go international.
Yeah.
Because at that time, the company doesn't have the like language expertise.
Yes.
That's
one of the main items people call us, because we actually operate in 150 different countries, 100 different languages. If we're doing annotation work in Germany like we are for eBay, they want people in market that understand those cultural nuances, everything to go with it. I mean, a good example is like if you're in India and you type in cricket score or World Cup scores, you expect to see the cricket scores. If you're in Brazil and you type in World Cup scores, you expect to see soccer scores. So all those cultural nuances play into the process.
And I think the other side of it, like, so for us, when we first started saying, okay, well, what are we actually going to demo and how are we going to do this, right? Like he hit it earlier, is this notion of developing the guidelines that you can then give as criteria. So as we started talking about query intent, I said, well, here's my understanding of query intent and how I think and how we think about query intent. And then he said, well, here's what we've been seeing with our other customers, and then you start to match those together, right? So, you know, again, it's never perfect, but you don't have any other option available to you yet. So it's also a great way to get bootstrapped into new environments and new content and all of that, you know, before you actually launch it. So I think with that, we're out of time.